Good evening, class. This is my first vlog. Yay! Back to vlogs. For discussion 1 for our second class in finance and budgeting. And this is dealing with revenues and well, it's class 1 and class 2 is really the discussion and what it's over. So, question 1. Ask, in reference to the reading addressing the factors affecting budgetary and financial considerations, were there any discussed that you found particularly surprising or enlightening, and why? Absolutely. As I was reading, there were a few that really stuck out. And the first one that stuck out was the increased competition for funding. I know there's always, especially with the recession of 2009, 2008, there's increased competition, but I don't think we realized, or I realized, how much competition for funding there really is until I really started reading a little bit more. Especially how money is tied to the completion rate. And, I mean, basically schools get paid more for completers. So that was interesting. Also, and I guess I kind of relate that back with, obviously I relate that back with my own experience, but with the state of Georgia, we have what we call, and I think most people know this, maybe the HOPE grant, and that stands for Helping Outstanding Pupils Educationally, I think. But once the recession hit, and HOPE used to be if you had a 3.0 GPA from high school. Once the recession hit, they changed the regulations on that, and it was harder to get the financial aid funding for students, seniors even graduating. They raised the GPA and a few other of the regulations and stipulations. Like now you have to have 4 classes of rigor, I think, coming out of high school, which is AP classes, dual enrollment, whereas used to you didn't have that. And I guess when I started reading this, I kind of put all that together of realizing just how harder it is that states are really making it harder for students and colleges to receive funding because there's so little of the funding to go around. So it's really a big picture that kind of starts all coming together. But yeah, so HOPE is an example of that because it's harder to get. With HOPE being harder to get for the students coming out of high school, that means that it's harder for students to pay to go to college, which means there's less funding, and the students in colleges, institutions are fighting over students to come to their college for that funding, so there's less funding to go around because there's less revenue coming into the colleges for the tuition. So that was a big picture, so that was interesting. Also, as far as the increased regulations really stuck out too, which was surprising about, it was under the discrimination section about, in Chapter 1, about the Rehabilitation Act of 1972 and the Americans with Disability Act in 1990. And it's interesting because you think about how much regulations and the regs that are tied to Disabilities Act and what institutions of higher education have to provide, as they should, I feel like, for disabilities, whether it's a ramp going up the stairs or handicapped bathroom with a lower sink, just things like that you don't really realize. Obviously they need to be at institutions of higher education, but there's no funding, there's no extra funding to compensate for the upgrading of the facilities to meet the codes and the regulations and the compliance. So it's interesting that schools can get deemed and in trouble for not providing such allocations and such accommodations at our institutions but yet there's no allocation provided for such upgrades at the facility. So that was enlightening as well. I also thought it interesting the factors affecting budgeting considerations was, and this kind of puts back in perspective the big picture, but the reduced tax bases at the state level. When the state level has a reduced tax rate due to high unemployment, reduced tax bases due to high unemployment rates, and the businesses closing and reductions, it leaves them, the state, not being able to help and meet their obligations to state institutions. So those state-funded dollars that help institutions, we've just seen less and less of those over the years, and it seems like institutions are having to rely more on local funding, and so that's kind of the big picture of, the well-oiled machine of, if it takes the well-oiled machine to keep these institutions running a lot of times, and if our institutions are heavily relying on state tax dollars, and that either is reduced heavily or not at all. I mean, I hate to say it, but I think it highlighted Iowa, that state. And anyway, if you cut that funding off, you are hurting that institution, because the state hurts the institution because they're really relying on the funding from taxpayers. If they're unemployed at this point, they can't pay their taxes. There's a lot of different things that go into it, and so that machine can't run as well as it did. I guess I just didn't realize how much unemployment really directly affects state institutions. Also, you look at furloughs of the past at institutions where faculty and staff basically were directly cut by institutions trying to recompensate and save money. So they basically let furloughs, where faculty and staff were just cut without pay for a period of days in the calendar year. Or a good example they provided was a reduction in equipment, replacing equipment. And, it is interesting because technology is so up to date and changes so constantly that it really inhibits, when you don't have the funding to update that technology that can be so expensive, it really inhibits replacing that equipment to keep up that status. So the other thing that I thought about when I was thinking about reduced taxes at the state level, and how it sometimes the state has in the past not been able to keep up their obligation to state funding for state institutions. I thought about, even now we have several positions in my institution that have just not been, they've been vacant and they're just not going to be filled. The institution's really trying to absorb that cost and recoup some of that money that they're not receiving from the state, or whatever level they've lost that at. So that's a way that I can see that our budget, we have to take in consideration our positions just not being filled. And ultimately what's happening is that work still has to be done, so other personnel are absorbing the weight of that job, but yet they're at the same pay they were as well. So it's kind of a vicious cycle of what's happening here. And budgets are tight. Budgets are very tight. So so that is question 1 on the discussion board. Question 2 addresses the smart revenue generators, the article for the 70 smart generators and money saving and money savers. It looks at, this article is very interesting because there were some that I thought, oh, that's really smart, and some I thought, I'm not so sure. So the first question is, how realistic did you find some of these ideas? Some of these ideas were good. However, for example, like number one, that was not very realistic to me. And that was using a bad economy to boost funding and fundraising. And I think the non-realistic part of that to me was it quoted 90% of the Monroe Community College graduates stay in the community. To me, that seems high. That seems like a very high percentage of people that stay in the community. And so that did not seem very realistic about those 90% giving back. I don't know the specific statistics on our technical college, but I wouldn't say it would be 90%. Number two didn't seem very realistic to me either, and that related to increasing the number of individuals to approach. Basically, this college, University of Oklahoma, brought in a consultant group, a firm, to look and develop the technology to match and use search. The firm hired to match records with data basis for the wealthiest in the U.S., and they matched that and contacted those alumni volunteers to match the ability of giving. To me, that doesn't seem really very realistic because it seems like a lot of manpower and it seems like a lot of technology, which seems very expensive. It sounded very expensive, so I just don't think that would be feasible for a lot of institutions. So some of them didn't seem realistic, some did. Some I thought were very good. Second question, were they campus originally specific? I would say some of them yes. I say yes because I feel like number 5, for example, employee personalized telemarketing, Monroe Community College. What stuck out to me on that was the campaign targets only parents with a predetermined income level. Basically, they called parents to reach out to see if they would be engaged. I just don't feel like specifically my college now, I would say 80% of our students, 90% of our students have financial aid. Hope, whether it be Hope or Pale, that help cover most of their tuition. So to reach out to them and the parents that had a predetermined income level, I don't see that that must be from a more of a fluent area college. So that to me seems like it's regionally specific. I don't see that being very productive at certain institutions. Also, in my opinion, are the certain organizational cultures more open to innovation than others? Absolutely. I attribute that to, I feel like some cultures are more, at some institutions, are just more set in their, how can I say this? They're more set in how they view funding and are just more stubborn, basically, to open the door to other funding resources. And, I think that goes back to maybe some more older institutions and set with how they do things, and it's always been that way type thing. So I absolutely think some are more open-minded institutions. The third question in the discussion 1 text addresses how, in the article of the 70 smart revenues, how revenue generators and money savers, what are some ideas that can be used to generate funds to help lower the cost of services such as mental health and health services?